Hello, my name is Adrian Soria and I am a law exchange student. I'm from Spain and I am going to introduce my employment law assignment. As a little presentation, in this case, our client, Mr. Vince, is a plumber, is employed as a plumber, but also he is a firefighter volunteer. So he is a firefighter volunteer in the status of standby time. So when he is needed, he is required to work. Starting with the first question, what does working time mean in this context? Explain the concept of entitlements and limits shortly. Okay, first of all, I would like to start saying that working time, and regarding the European Commission definition, is every period in which the employee is working at the employer's disposal or carrying out his activities. So, in this case, you don't have to properly work, just being under the instructions of the employer, limiting or restricting his liberty. In this case, Mr. Vince, in the firefighter volunteer activity, he has to respond calls within 10 minutes and he has to be present in a certain place physically within 30 minutes. So this time will be considered as a disposal time because he is under the instructions of his boss and he has to be present and answering calls whenever is required. So, as I mentioned before, following the definition of the European Commission in the directive, disposal time is considered as working time. And the main reason that disposal time is considered as working time is because there's only one distinction between rest time and working time. And within rest time, there is no disposal time. It's freedom and rest for the worker. So, in this case, he has no rest if he has to be ready to a possible call and to be present in a certain place. And the most clear argument that supports the idea of being this working time is the fact that he got a disciplinary fee because of the lack of presence in the plumber work due to the requirement of being in the fire services. So this made him receive a fine. So in this case, in our client's professional activity, we have to distinguish between the working time regarding the firefighter volunteer activities and the working time regarding his job as a plumber. Talking about the limits and entitlements shortly, we have to point out that the minimum rest between working days is 11 hours. There is an obligatory break if the working days is longer than 6 hours, and there is a minimum 24 hours weekly rest apart from the 11-hour daily rest. And also, one of the most important things is that the worker cannot work more than 48 hours per week. This is important in this case because if Mr. Vince is being employed as a plumber and also as a firefighter volunteer, between those activities cannot be more than 48 hours worked per week. So in this case, prior activity is the plumber job, so the firefighter activities cannot be more in total than 48 hours, taking into account the hours performed as a plumber. For the second question, how has the term working time been interpreted in the case law of the CJEU? I'm going to talk about 4 cases. The first one, in the Ville de Nivelles versus Routematzak case, is the case number 518/15. The worker had to respond to calls from his employer within 8 minutes and to remain physically present in Nivelles fire station. Then he was considered a standby worker because he has to be present when required. And the fact of having to be present in 8 minutes physically restricted his possibilities of going out the town, for example. So is an important restriction to his personal life, so it couldn't be considered as resting time. So that stated the court that the requirements of his professional activity limited the opportunities to carry out other activity. So that's the reason that it was considered as working time. For the second case, I'm going to talk about the case number 151/02, Jagger case. Jagger was a doctor that was performing on-call duties in a hospital, so he was required to be physically present and to work when required. Then he had a room with a bed where he could rest when he wasn't needed, but he had to be physically present, so his personal liberty was totally restricted. The court stated the same. He couldn't perform any other activity in this time, so it was considered working time. In my third case, I have the case number 266/14. This is a security company who employed alarms and security system workers. So they have to set up alarms in the client houses. So they have to go for the first client, from his own house to the client's house. So maybe sometimes they have to drive 3 hours. The problem was that the working time was considered as the first client that they attended, so the 3 hours drive wasn't counted as working time. So the court again stated that this time driven was considered as working time because there wasn't any opportunity to develop new activities, etc. And for the last case, I have one very similar to Jagger case. It's the case number 303/98, which is also called SAMAP case, SAMAP case. And in this case, doctors were in the same situation as Jagger case. They had to spend on-call time after his working day. So they have to be physically present when required and ready to answer calls. So they could attend some patients that have any unforeseen issue. So they cannot perform any other activities during this time, which is not resting time, is working time, as the court stated. So, as a conclusion, the court is going to state that in every case that the activity related to work restricts the personal liberty or the freedom to develop or perform another activity, professional or personal activity, it should be considered as working time. So, for the third question, does standby service at home constitute working time in light of EU law? First of all, I would like to point out that in the life of a worker, there are two types of time: rest period and working time. So, cannot be a standby time, which is considered working time inside the rest period time. In this case, the two main points are that our client, Mr. Beans, is obliged to answer calls within 10 minutes and he has to be physically present at a determined place in 30 minutes. In the light of EU law, standby services constitute working time in these three cases. The first one is if the worker has to remain geographically proximate to the workplace, or if he has the duty to answer calls, or he has the duty of being physically present in a certain place in a certain amount of time. So, having said that, the main criteria to follow is whether the standby activity constitutes a big restriction to the personal life of the worker, which means that he could not perform any other professional activity because he could be required to work in a certain moment. As the fourth question, we have: can states derogate from the definition of working time? First of all, the answer is no. They cannot derogate from the definition, but they can apply more favorable conditions to the workers. In the article number 23 and 15 of the Directive 2003/88, it says that without prejudice to the right of the member state to develop different regulatory provisions in the field of working time as long as they comply with the minimum requirements. For example, in this case, the maximum working time per week is 48 hours, but states can reduce this amount of time worked. For example, Spain has 40 hours per week work, so it's a more favorable disposition for the workers. The next question is, can states derogate from all the obligation under the directive because Mr. Beans is a volunteer? First of all, I would like to introduce the CJEU line that says that volunteer firefighters who pursue real activities, have an employer and receive a remuneration are considered as workers. So, in this case, it seems like Mr. Beans is not a worker because in most European countries, the firefighters volunteers are not truly volunteers because they got paid a decent amount of money. So, it's in a more professional way rather than in this case that looks more casual, so he's not supposed to be required every day. Another interesting point is that in the case 518/15, the Court of Justice confirmed that the national court of each member state should decide whether these conditions are not or are constitutive of a worker, depending on the situation and the conditions of the volunteer. After this little introduction, I would like to point out a parliamentary question that I found answered on the internet. Is the P001195/2019, so it's pretty recent. And it says that even if Mr. Beans is not considered as a worker, some provisions of the Directive 2003/88 are still applicable. And these are the two following ones: the maximum weekly average of working time and the minimum daily and weekly rest period. And also another important point is that in this parliamentary question answered was stated that the volunteers are not considered an object of application of this directive. And the last thing to mention is that member states can introduce an opt-out which allows individual workers to consent not to be restricted by the maximum average weekly working time, which could let this worker or this volunteer to spend more than 48 per week working, but that depends on the state. So, as a conclusion, and regarding the interests of Mr. Beans, the maximum weekly average of working time and the minimum daily and weekly rest period is the same for volunteers and for workers, which is the main point for him, I think, because the 48-hour weekly worked is still the same restriction. So I think it's quite interesting for him to be compatible the firefighter volunteer activities with the plumber professional activities. And the last question is, how should the issue in relation to the remuneration of Mr. Beans be approached? Regarding this question, I don't find the relation of just asking for €1 compensation. I think it's more interesting to ask for the proportional working time paid. For example, he was paid 500 per month. He will have to ask for the proportional amount of money for the time not considered as working time and now constituting working time. And in the other situation, if Mr. Bean has never been paid, in my opinion, there shouldn't be any economic compensation. Because this €1 compensation is because the start of being considered these standby services as working time. So if he has never been paid, there is no economic reason to be paid now. But in my opinion, for Mr. Bean, this is not the most important concern, because €1 is a symbolic amount of money. But the most important thing is that the consideration of working time of these standby services constitute an increase in the social benefits that he could require. For example, social security, social benefits. So these standby services will constitute working time, and this working time will be counted as time spent to increase the amount of money he could receive in any social benefit. And then for his retirement could also be so interesting for him to have more time worked, so more money that he could receive.